The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Kensington Palace as William stood in his mother's former study, surrounded by boxes that had remained untouched for nearly 25 years. The room still carried traces of her presence. The faint scent of her favorite perfume seemed to linger in the air, and afternoon light filtered through the same curtains she had once drawn back each morning. His father had finally agreed it was time to sort through Diana's personal belongings. Charles had avoided this task for years, finding it too painful, too raw. But now, with William in his 40s and having children of his own, the king felt his eldest son was ready to take on this emotional responsibility. William ran his fingers along the edge of a mahogany desk where his mother had once written letters to charities, planned her engagements, and stolen quiet moments away from the relentless scrutiny of royal life. The desk drawers had been left exactly as she had arranged them, a testament to the reverence with which her space had been preserved. The first few boxes contained what he expected: photographs, correspondence with various charitable organizations, programs from events she had attended. Each item told a piece of her story, but these were the public fragments of her life, the carefully curated image that the world had seen. William found himself looking for something more personal, something that would help him understand the woman behind the princess, the mother behind the icon. It was in the fourth box, nestled beneath a collection of handwritten thank-you notes from family she had helped, that his fingers brushed against something unexpected. A leather-bound journal, its burgundy cover worn smooth by countless touches. The spine bore no title, no identifying marks, just the subtle indentation where her hands had held it. William's heart began to race. He had never known his mother kept a diary. Throughout all the biographies, documentaries, and endless speculation about her private thoughts, no one had mentioned a personal journal. He held the book carefully, as if it were made of the most delicate glass. The weight of it surprised him. This was not some decorative notebook purchased for appearance's sake. The pages within were thick with ink, filled with his mother's distinctive handwriting. Years of thoughts, feelings, and experiences were contained within these covers. A direct line to understanding Diana in her own words, unfiltered by the interpretations of others. William settled into the chair behind her desk and opened the journal to the first page. The date at the top made his breath catch. July 1st, 1961, just a few days before her 20th birthday. The marriage to his father was still 2 weeks away. This diary had been with her through everything: the wedding, the early years of marriage, the births of both William and Harry, the struggles, the triumphs, and ultimately her final years. The early entries revealed a young woman full of hope and nervous excitement. Diana wrote about her final dress fittings, about the surreal experience of knowing the world would be watching her walk down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral. But even in these early pages, William could sense an underlying anxiety, a fear that she was not prepared for the life that awaited her. Sometimes I catch myself in mirrors and wonder if this is really happening, she had written. In 2 weeks, I'll be the Princess of Wales. People will expect so much from me, and I'm terrified I'll disappoint them all. But Charles loves me, and I love him, and surely that's enough to build a life on. William paused, struck by the innocence in her words. His mother had been younger when she married than he was now, thrust into a role for which no one could truly prepare. The diary revealed her vulnerability in a way that no official account ever had. As he continued reading, the entries became more complex. Diana wrote about the overwhelming nature of royal protocol, about feeling lost in the vast corridors of palaces that were supposed to be her home, but felt more like magnificent prisons. She described the loneliness of being surrounded by people whose job it was to serve her, but who couldn't truly be her friends. I miss being able to just call someone and chat, read one entry from late 1981. Everyone here speaks to me with such formality. I understand the importance of protocol, but sometimes I just want someone to ask how I'm really feeling, not how I'm finding my new role or how honored I am to serve. The wedding preparations were documented in meticulous detail, but not the public spectacle that the world had witnessed. Diana wrote about private moments, crying in her dress during a final fitting because the stress had caused her to lose too much weight, staying awake the night before the wedding because she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to lose herself entirely. "Who will I be tomorrow?" she had written the night before becoming Princess of Wales. "I feel like I'm about to step through a door that will close behind me forever. There's no going back to being just Diana Spencer, the kindergarten teacher who liked to dance and dreamed of having a simple family. Tomorrow I become someone else entirely." William found himself completely absorbed in these revelations. He had heard stories about his mother's wedding, had seen the footage countless times, but this perspective was entirely new. Here was Diana's own account of what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, and it was filled with as much trepidation as joy. The entries from her honeymoon revealed the beginning of cracks in what the public assumed was a fairy tale romance. Diana wrote about feeling like she was competing with a memory, about conversations that felt stilted, about the growing realization that the man she had fallen in love with was different from the one she had married. "He's so focused on his duties, on what's expected of him," she wrote during their time at Balmoral. "I try to talk to him about how overwhelming everything feels, but he sees my concerns as complaints about a life that millions would envy. He doesn't understand that being envied isn't the same as being happy." But it wasn't all sadness and disillusionment. William found entries that sparkled with joy, particularly those written during her pregnancies and after his and Harry's births. Diana's love for her children radiated from every word she wrote about them. "William has the most serious little face," she had written when he was just 6 months old. "He studies everything so intently, as if he's trying to understand the world he's been born into. Sometimes I catch him looking at me with these wise eyes, and I wonder if he somehow knows that I'm figuring this out as I go along. I want so desperately to protect him from the pressures that will come with being the future king, but I also want him to know that he can be whoever he chooses to be within that role." These entries about his early childhood painted a picture of a mother who was completely devoted, but also deeply concerned about the path laid out for her sons. Diana wrote about her determination to give them as normal a childhood as possible, about sneaking them out of the palace for trips to McDonald's and theme parks, about her frustration when royal protocol interfered with what she saw as simple parenting decisions. They deserve to know what it feels like to wait in line for something, to be disappointed when a ride is closed, to have their picture taken by tourists who just think they're cute kids, not future kings, she wrote after one of their clandestine outings. "These small freedoms feel revolutionary, but they shouldn't be. They should just be childhood." William was particularly moved by an entry written after one of his school sports days. Diana described watching him run a race, how proud she was of his determination, and how her heart broke a little when she noticed the way other parents kept their distance from him, not out of disrespect, but because his presence made them uncertain about how to behave naturally. He won the race, but I could see the loneliness in his eyes when no one cheered quite the same way they did for the other children, she had written. "I want to wrap him up and protect him from all of this, but I know that's not possible. Instead, I have to teach him how to find joy and meaning within the constraints of what his life will be." As William read these maternal observations, he found himself remembering moments from his childhood with new clarity. He recalled his mother's fierce protectiveness, her insistence on certain freedoms that had seemed like normal parenting at the time, but now revealed themselves as carefully fought battles against an institution that had very different ideas about how royal children should be raised. The diary also revealed Diana's growing interest in charitable work, but not as the calculated public relations moves that cynics sometimes portrayed them as. Her entries showed a genuine evolution of understanding about her position and how she could use it to make a difference. "I was visiting the hospital today, just another royal obligation on the calendar," she wrote about what became one of her most famous engagements. "But then I met Sarah, a young woman about my age who's been fighting cancer. She was so thin, so fragile, but her spirit was incredible. She told me that seeing me there made her feel like someone important cared about what she was going through. It hit me then, this isn't just about showing up and being seen. This is about connection, about using whatever influence I have to make people feel less alone in their struggles. This entry marked a turning point in the diary. After this hospital visit, Diana's writing became more purposeful, more focused on how she could shape her role rather than simply endure it. She wrote about researching various causes, about feeling genuinely excited about engagements for the first time since her marriage. "I think I'm finally understanding what it means to be Princess of Wales," she wrote several weeks later. "It's not about wearing the right clothes or saying the right things. It's about using this platform to shine light on people and causes that might otherwise remain in shadow. For the first time since the wedding, I feel like I have a purpose that's truly my own." But alongside these moments of professional fulfillment, the diary documented the continuing deterioration of her marriage. Diana wrote about feeling increasingly isolated, about conversations with Charles that felt more like briefings than intimate exchanges between spouses. She described the growing presence of Camilla Parker Bowles in their lives, not with anger initially, but with a confusion that gradually transformed into something much more painful. "I know she was important to him before we married," Diana wrote about Camilla in an entry from 1983. "I accepted that. I even tried to be friendly when we encountered each other at various functions. But lately, I feel like I'm intruding on something when I'm with my own husband. There are references I don't understand, shared memories that predate me, and a familiarity between them that makes me feel like the outsider in my own marriage." The entries from this period reveal Diana's growing understanding of the complex situation she had entered. She wrote about feeling naive for believing that marriage would automatically create the deep connection she craved, about her struggle to compete with a relationship that had years of history behind it. "I keep telling myself that I'm imagining things, that my insecurities are making me paranoid," she wrote. "But yesterday I called him, and she answered his private line. She was there in his study, going through correspondence that should have been between husband and wife. When I asked about it later, Charles made it sound perfectly normal, as if I was being unreasonable for questioning it. Maybe I am. Maybe this is just how things work in this world, and I need to adjust my expectations." William found these entries particularly difficult to read. As an adult who had lived through his own marriage and understood the complexities of relationships, he could see his mother's pain with a clarity that would have been impossible when he was a child. The diary revealed not a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge, but a young woman trying desperately to understand why her marriage was failing and wondering if she was somehow to blame. The final entries in this section of the diary were written during what William knew had been one of the lowest periods of his parents' marriage. Diana wrote about feeling completely alone, about putting on a public face that grew more exhausting with each engagement. "People see me at these events, and they tell me how lucky I am, how wonderful my life must be," she wrote after a particularly challenging royal tour. "If only they knew that I spend most of my time feeling like I'm drowning in plain sight. Charles and I barely speak anymore unless it's about official business. The boys are my only joy, but even they're starting to sense the tension. William asked me yesterday why Daddy doesn't kind of tuck him in anymore. I didn't know what to say." William closed the diary, his hands trembling slightly. He had only read through the first few years of his mother's entries, but already his understanding of his childhood had been fundamentally altered. The woman revealed in these pages was more complex, more vulnerable, and more human than the public figure he thought he knew. The rain had stopped, and the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the study. William looked around the room with new eyes, seeing it now as the sanctuary where his mother had poured her heart onto these pages, where she had tried to make sense of a life that often felt beyond her control. He realized that this diary was more than just a historical document or a personal keepsake. It was an opportunity to understand his mother as a complete person, not just the idealized memory he had carried or the tragic figure the world mourned. In her own words, Diana was revealing herself to be a young woman who had made mistakes, felt deep pain, experienced genuine love, and ultimately found ways to transform her suffering into a force for good in the world. William carefully placed the diary back in its box, but he knew he would return to it. There were still years of entries to read, including the period when his parents' marriage publicly collapsed, when Diana found her voice as an advocate for causes close to her heart, and, ultimately, the final months of her life. As he prepared to leave the study, William felt a profound sense of gratitude. His mother had left him a gift more precious than any title or inheritance: the truth of who she was, in her own words, unfiltered and honest. Tomorrow, he would continue reading, ready to learn more about the remarkable woman who had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to understand. William returned to his mother's study the following morning, the leather-bound diary weighing heavily on his mind throughout a restless night. The autumn sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like memories coming to life. He had barely slept, his thoughts consumed by the revelations from Diana's early entries. Settling back in her chair, William opened the diary to where he had left off. The next section began in 1985, a year that had been publicly celebrated as one of triumph for the royal family. But Diana's private words told a very different story. The tour of Australia was supposed to be a fresh start for Charles and me, she had written upon their return. The papers called it a triumph, and in many ways it was. The crowds were incredible, and for the first time, I felt like I was truly connecting with people in my role. But the success fell hollow because Charles seemed almost resentful of the attention I received. I wasn't trying to outshine him. I was just being myself. But, apparently, that was the problem. William remembered hearing stories about that tour, how Diana had captivated the Australian public and media. Reading her account now, he understood that what should have been a professional high point had actually deepened the fissures in his parents' marriage. Diana wrote extensively about the pressure of constantly being photographed and analyzed. Every gesture, every outfit, every expression was scrutinized and interpreted. She described feeling like she was living in a fishbowl, where even her most private moments could become public spectacle. I changed my dress 3 times before charity luncheon today because I kept thinking about how the photos would be analyzed, she wrote. Too formal, and they'll say I'm out of touch. Too casual, and they'll say I'm not taking the role seriously. Too colorful, and they'll say I'm attention-seeking. Too muted, and they'll say I look sad or unwell. Sometimes I wonder if there's any choice I can make that won't be criticized by someone. But, alongside these struggles with public life, Diana's entries revealed her growing confidence in her charitable work. She wrote about discovering causes that genuinely moved her, about learning to use her position to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. I spent the afternoon with families affected by HIV, she wrote after what William knew had been a groundbreaking visit that challenged public perceptions about the disease. The fear and ignorance surrounding this illness is heartbreaking. These are people who are already suffering, and society's rejection makes their pain so much worse. I held hands with patients. I hugged children who haven't seen their fathers in months because of stigma. If my presence there helps even one person understand that HIV doesn't make someone untouchable, then every criticism about my involvement will be worth it. This entry marked a pivotal moment in Diana's evolution. William could see how his mother had transformed her personal pain into a driving force for social change. Her own experience of feeling isolated and misunderstood had given her a unique ability to connect with others who felt marginalized. The diary entries from this period also revealed Diana's deep involvement in her sons' lives. She wrote about every milestone, every conversation, every moment that revealed their developing personalities. William came home from school today upset because some older boys were teasing him about his future role, she wrote when William was about 7 years old. He asked me if he could just be a regular person when he grows up. My heart broke a little, but I told him that being special doesn't mean being separate, and that his future position gives him a chance to help more people than most people ever could. I hope I handled it right. Sometimes I feel like I'm making up the rules as I go along. Reading this entry, William remembered that exact conversation. He had felt overwhelmed by the weight of expectations, even as a child, and his mother's words had somehow made the burden feel more like an opportunity. Now, understanding the thought and care that had gone into her response, he felt an even deeper appreciation for her wisdom. Diana also wrote candidly about her struggles with bulimia, a battle that had been largely hidden from the public at the time. Her entries revealed the complex relationship between her emotional state and her eating disorder. "The control it gives me is an illusion. I know that," she wrote during what must have been a particularly difficult period. "But when everything else in my life feels chaotic and uncertain, when I feel like I'm failing as a wife and struggling to meet everyone's expectations as a princess, this feels like the one thing that's entirely mine to manage. Of course, it's not managing anything at all. It's just making everything worse. But logic doesn't seem to matter when I'm in that mindset." These entries were painful for William to read, but they also provided context for behavior he hadn't fully understood as a child. He remembered his mother's fluctuating energy levels, her occasional withdrawal, and now he realized these had been symptoms of a struggle she was fighting largely alone. But the diary also documented Diana's journey toward healing. She wrote about seeking help, about the difficulty of admitting vulnerability when the world expected her to be perfect. "I started seeing someone today, a therapist who specializes in eating disorders," she wrote in an entry for 1987. "It felt strange, almost rebellious, to acknowledge that I need help. But I keep thinking about William and Harry, about what kind of example I'm setting. They deserve a mother who models how to deal with problems, not how to hide from them." The entries from the late 1980s revealed Diana hitting her stride as both a mother and a public figure. She wrote about feeling more confident in her role, about finding genuine joy in her charitable work, and about her fierce determination to give her sons a childhood that balanced royal responsibility with normal experiences. "Took the boys to Thorpe Park today without any security," she wrote after one of their secret outings. "We waited in line like everyone else, ate terrible food, and William got sick on one of the roller coasters. It was perfect. They need to know what it feels like to be treated like regular children, even if it's just for a few hours." But these happier entries were increasingly interspersed with evidence of her marriage's continued deterioration. Diana wrote about feeling like she and Charles were living parallel lives, connected only by their children and their public duties. "We attended 3 events together this week, and I doubt we exchanged more than a dozen words that weren't related to logistics or protocol," she wrote. "We smile for the cameras, we stand side by side, and people assume we're a happy couple. But we're more like professional colleagues who happen to share a surname and a house." The diary entries from 1989 and 1990 revealed Diana's growing awareness that her marriage was beyond repair, but also her determination to protect her children from the worst effects of the breakdown. "Charles and I had another argument about the boys' education," she wrote. "He wants them to follow the traditional path, boarding school at 8, the same route he took. But I can see how much William needs stability right now, how sensitive he is to the tension between us. Sending him away feels cruel, but I'm being told that my maternal instincts are interfering with their royal education. Sometimes I wonder if caring too much is seen as a weakness in this family." William paused at this entry, remembering the discussions about his education. At the time, he hadn't fully understood why his parents disagreed so strongly about his schooling, but now he could see it was about much more than academic choices. It was about competing visions of what kind of future king he should become. Diana's entries also revealed her growing public confidence and her willingness to challenge royal conventions. She wrote about speeches she had given, causes she had championed despite resistance, and her determination to use her platform meaningfully. "I gave a speech about landmines today, and I could see some of the palace officials cringing," she wrote. Apparently, discussing international weapons policy is too political for a princess. But how can you look at photographs of children who have lost limbs to these devices and worry about political implications? Some things are too important for protocol. The entries from this period showed Diana becoming more assertive, more willing to follow her own moral compass, even when it conflicted with royal tradition. William could see how his mother had evolved from the uncertain young woman who had married his father into someone who understood her own power and wasn't afraid to use it for causes she believed in. But the personal cost of this evolution was evident in her more private entries. Diana wrote about loneliness, about feeling like she was constantly performing, and about her struggle to maintain hope for her marriage. I tried to talk to Charles about us today, about whether we could find a way back to each other, she wrote in what must have been a particularly vulnerable moment. But he looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. I think we become such different people that we can't even recognize what we once meant to each other. Maybe we never really knew each other at all. The diary also documented Diana's relationships with other members of the royal family. She wrote about feeling like an outsider, about traditions and expectations that seemed designed to exclude rather than embrace. Christmas at Sandringham was as difficult as always, she wrote after the 1990 holidays. I watch everyone else seeming to know their place in all the rituals, and I still feel like I'm guessing at the rules. The Queen is polite, but distant, and I can't tell if she disapproves of me personally or if this is just how things are. Sometimes I think they're all waiting for me to prove I don't belong here, and I'm starting to wonder if they're right. These entries provided William with insight into his mother's relationship with his grandmother and the rest of the family. As someone who had grown up within the royal system, he understood the subtle dynamics Diana was describing, but reading about them from her perspective helped him see how alienating the experience could be for someone who hadn't been raised within that world. The diary entries from 1991 revealed Diana's growing realization that she needed to create her own identity separate from her role as Charles's wife. She wrote about developing friendships outside royal circles, about pursuing interests that weren't directly related to her official duties. I'm taking writing lessons again, she wrote. Not because it's expected or because it fits the image of a princess, but because I loved it as a girl and I want to remember what it feels like to do something purely for joy. It sounds simple, but after years of analyzing every choice through the lens of public perception, doing something just because I want to feels revolutionary. But perhaps the most revealing entries from this period were those that documented Diana's internal struggle with her public image. The media had begun to portray her as either a saint or a victim, and she wrote about how limiting both characterizations felt. The papers either make me sound like a perfect princess who can do no wrong, or like a tragic figure who needs to be rescued, she wrote. Both versions leave out the most important part. I'm a real person who makes mistakes, has bad days, gets frustrated, and is still figuring out how to be the best version of myself. The perfection is a burden, and the pity is insulting. I wish they could see that I'm neither a saint nor a victim. I'm just a woman trying to do good work while navigating a very complicated situation. As William read these entries, he found himself seeing his mother's public treatment with new eyes. The media narrative that had surrounded Diana throughout his childhood suddenly seemed much more problematic and reductive than he had realized at the time. The diary also revealed Diana's growing concern about her son's exposure to media attention. She wrote about trying to balance their need for privacy with the public's fascination with the royal family. William has started to notice the photographers more, she wrote when he was about 9 years old. He asked me yesterday why people want to take our picture when we're just going to the park. How do you explain to a child that his existence is considered entertainment? I wanted to understand the responsibility that comes with his position, but I also want him to feel normal and loved, not like a performer in someone else's story. The final entries in this section of the diary were written in late 1991, as Diana's marriage approached what would become a very public crisis. But rather than bitterness or anger, these entries revealed a woman who was finding her own strength and purpose. I'm not the same person who married Charles 10 years ago, she wrote in one of the last entries William read that day. That young woman was looking for someone else to define her, to give her life meaning. I've learned that I have to create my own meaning, and I think I'm finally beginning to understand what that looks like. The boys are my priority, but they're not my only purpose. I have work to do in this world that only I can do, and for the first time in years, I'm excited about my future instead of afraid of it. William closed the diary as the afternoon light began to fade. The woman revealed in these pages was more complex and admirable than he had even imagined. Diana had not been a passive victim of circumstances, but someone who had actively worked to transform her pain into purpose, her isolation into connection with others who felt marginalized. Tomorrow, he would read about the period when his parents' marriage publicly collapsed, when Diana found her independent voice, and when she began to chart a course that would ultimately define her legacy. But for now, William sat quietly in his mother's study, feeling grateful for the privilege of seeing her through her own eyes, understanding finally the depth of her strength and the breadth of her love that on the third day, William approached his mother's diary with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He knew the entries ahead would cover the most turbulent period of Diana's life, the public breakdown of her marriage, her battle with the royal establishment, and her emergence as an independent force for change. The leather-bound journal seemed to pulse with the weight of secrets yet to be revealed. The entries from 1992 began with a tone William hadn't encountered before, a sense of resolution mixed with sadness, as if Diana had finally accepted that her marriage was ending and was preparing herself for what would come next. "The separation will be announced officially soon," she wrote in what must have been early December. Strange how something that feels so inevitable can still be shocking when it becomes real. Part of me is relieved that we can stop pretending, but another part grieves for the fairy tale that never really existed. The hardest part isn't losing Charles. I think I lost him years ago. The hardest part is knowing that William and Harry will grow up with divorced parents, something I never wanted for them. Reading this, William felt a pang of recognition. He remembered the strange atmosphere in the house during that time, the hushed conversations between staff members, the way his parents seemed to exist in completely separate worlds even when they were in the same room. Diana's entries from this period revealed her deep concern about how the separation would affect her sons. She wrote extensively about conversations with child psychologists, about researching how to help children cope with divorce, about her determination to shield them from the worst aspects of the public scrutiny that would follow. Had a long talk with William today, she wrote a few days after the separation announcement. He's trying so hard to be grown up about everything, to take care of Harry, and even to take care of me. He asked if it was his fault that Daddy was moving out. I held him and told him that sometimes adults can't find a way to be happy together, but that doesn't mean they don't love their children completely. I hope he believes me. I hope I'm handling this right. William remembered that conversation with crystal clarity. His mother's words had stayed with him throughout the difficult months that followed. And, reading them now, he understood how much thought and care had gone into every phrase she had chosen. But the diary also revealed Diana's own struggle to process the failure of her marriage while maintaining the public facade expected of her. She wrote about attending royal events alone, about the awkwardness of protocol when the principal players were no longer speaking, about feeling like she was performing a role in a play whose script kept changing. "Attended the state banquet for the President of France tonight," she wrote. "Charles and I stood in the receiving line together, shook hands, smiled, made small talk with dignitaries as if nothing had changed. The irony wasn't lost on me. We're better at being polite strangers than we ever were at being married. At least now the performance has an end time." The entries from 1993 reveal Diana beginning to find her footing as a separated woman navigating royal life on her own terms. She wrote about the freedom of being able to schedule her own engagements, to choose causes without having to consider how they might reflect on Charles, to speak more authentically about issues she cared about. "I'm working with a new AIDS hospice, and for the first time, I don't have to worry about whether my involvement might embarrass anyone or seem too controversial," she wrote. "I could just focus on the people who need help and the difference I might be able to make. It's liberating in a way I hadn't expected. But this newfound independence came at a cost." Diana wrote about feeling isolated from the royal family, about losing friendships with people who felt they had to choose sides, about the challenge of raising her sons within an institution that she was no longer fully part of. "The boys came back from Balmoral today, and it's clear they've been told things about the situation that paint me in a certain light," she wrote after one of their visits to Scotland. I won't put them in the position of having to choose between their parents, but it's hard to watch them process information that I can't correct or respond to. I have to trust that my relationship with them is strong enough to withstand whatever they're hearing elsewhere. The diary entries from this period also documented Diana's growing confidence in her public role. She wrote about major speeches she was planning, about international trips that would establish her as an independent advocate rather than just a supporting player in the royal drama. I'm going to Angola to highlight the landmine crisis, she wrote while planning what would become one of her most famous campaigns. The palace is nervous about the political implications, but some things transcend politics. When children are losing limbs because of weapons that remain dangerous years after conflicts have ended, someone needs to speak up. If my position gives me a platform to do that, then I'm going to use it. William remembered the controversy that had surrounded his mother's landmine campaign, how some critics had accused her of overstepping her role. Reading her private thoughts about the issue, he was struck by her moral clarity and her willingness to accept criticism in service of a cause she believed in. The diary also revealed Diana's complex feelings about media attention during this period. While she had often felt victimized by press coverage during her marriage, she was learning to see publicity as a tool that could be used strategically to advance her charitable work. The photographers who once felt like tormentors are now sometimes allies, she wrote. When I visit a hospice or meet with families affected by HIV, their pictures tell stories that might not otherwise be told. I'm learning to work with the media instead of just enduring it. Of course, they still invade my privacy and sensationalize my personal life, but at least now I can sometimes direct their attention toward issues that matter. But the personal cost of her public visibility was evident throughout her entries. Diana wrote about the difficulty of dating under intense scrutiny, about feeling like every friendship was analyzed for romantic potential, about the challenge of maintaining any semblance of a normal private life. Went to dinner with James tonight, and by tomorrow there will be speculation about whether we're romantically involved. She wrote about what was clearly a platonic friendship. I can't have a conversation with any man without it being dissected and analyzed. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be able to have a genuine relationship again, or if everyone I meet will be influenced by the circus that surrounds my life. The entries from 1994 and 1995 show Diana hitting her stride as an independent public figure. She wrote about successful campaigns, meaningful relationships with charitable organizations, and a growing sense of her own identity separate from her role as Charles's ex-wife. The leprosy mission in India was extraordinary, she wrote after one of her most impactful trips. I held hands with patients that many people won't even approach, and I could see the difference it made, not just for them, but for public understanding of the disease. This is what I was meant to do with this strange position I've found myself in. Not to cut ribbons or make polite conversation, but to use whatever influence I have to change hearts and minds about people who are suffering. But the diary also documented Diana's ongoing struggles with depression and her search for meaning in a life that often felt surreal. She wrote about therapy sessions, about spiritual seeking, about her attempts to find peace within a situation that offered very little privacy or normalcy. Some days I feel like I'm living in a goldfish bowl where everyone can see me, but no one can really reach me, she wrote during what must have been a particularly difficult period. The loneliness is the hardest part. I'm surrounded by people all the time, but so few of them know the real me. They know the princess, they know the charity patron, they know the tabloid figure, but the woman underneath all of that feels invisible sometimes. These entries provided William with insight into his mother's emotional state during a time when he had been away at school and therefore less aware of her daily struggles. He began to understand how much effort it had taken for her to maintain a positive demeanor during their time together, how she had protected him and Harry from the worst of her pain. The diary entries from 1995 build toward what William knew had been the turning point in his mother's public life, her decision to give the Panorama interview with Martin Bashir. Her entries leading up to that decision revealed a woman who felt cornered by circumstances and desperate to tell her own story. "I'm tired of other people controlling the narrative about my life," she wrote while considering the interview. "Every story about me is filtered through someone else's agenda. The Palaces, Charles's, the media's. I want to speak for myself, to explain my choices and my actions in my own words. I know it's risky, but staying silent feels riskier at this point." Reading these entries, William felt a complex mix of emotions. The interview had caused enormous controversy and had ultimately led to his mother being stripped of her HRH title. But her diary revealed her thought process, her feeling that she had been backed into a corner where speaking out felt like her only option. "I know the palace will be furious," she wrote the night before the interview aired. "I know this will change everything, probably not in ways that benefit me. But I refuse to be a victim of other people's stories anymore." William and Harry deserve to know that their mother fought for her truth, even when it was difficult. The aftermath of the interview was documented in painful detail. Diana wrote about feeling liberated and terrified simultaneously, about the backlash she faced from the royal establishment, and about her concern for how the controversy would affect her sons. "William was so angry when he came home from school," she wrote after the interview aired. "He felt blindsided, embarrassed by the attention it brought. I tried to explain why I felt I had to speak out, but he's at an age where any parental behavior that makes him stand out feels like betrayal. I hope someday he'll understand that I was trying to claim my own voice, not hurt him." William remembered his reaction to the interview, his teenage anger at seeing their private family business discussed so publicly. Reading his mother's account of their conversation, he felt a deep regret for not being more supportive during what had clearly been one of the most difficult periods of her life. The diary entries from 1996 showed Diana dealing with the consequences of her decision to speak publicly. She wrote about being stripped of her royal title, about the divorce proceedings, about her determination to maintain her charitable work despite the institutional barriers being placed in her way. "They've taken away the HRH, but they can't take away the work," she wrote with characteristic determination. "If anything, being outside the formal structure might give me more freedom to tackle controversial issues. I don't need a title to hold someone's hand or to bring attention to suffering." The work was never about the protocol anyway. But the diary also revealed Diana's deep hurt at being formally expelled from the royal family while being expected to co-parent within it. She wrote about the complexity of maintaining relationships with people who had essentially rejected her, about explaining to her sons why she was no longer technically their equal in terms of royal status. "Harry asked me yesterday if I'm still a real princess," she wrote in one particularly poignant entry. "I told him that being a princess isn't about titles or protocol. It's about how you treat people and whether you use whatever advantages you have to help others. But inside, I was heartbroken that my 6-year-old has to think about such things at all." The final entries from this section of the diary showed Diana entering 1997 with a sense of renewed purpose despite the personal costs of her independence. She wrote about plans for new charitable initiatives, about her relationship with Dodi, and about her hopes for the future. "I feel like I'm finally becoming the person I was meant to be," she wrote in one of the last entries William read that day. "It's taken years to shed the expectations others had for me and figure out what I actually believe, what I actually want to accomplish. The princess they created was never really me anyway." This version, more controversial maybe, certainly less constrained by protocol. This feels authentic in a way I've never experienced before. As William closed the diary for the third day, he felt overwhelmed by the complexity of his mother's journey. The woman revealed in these pages had faced extraordinary pressures and had made difficult choices, some of which had been controversial even among those who loved her. But through it all, she had maintained her commitment to using her position to help others, and she had refused to be silenced or diminished by circumstances that could have destroyed a less determined person. Tomorrow, he would read the final section, Diana's entries from the last months of her life, including her thoughts about her relationship with Dodi, her plans for the future, and her final reflections on motherhood and legacy. But tonight, William sat quietly in his mother's study, feeling a profound respect for the courage it had taken for her to chart her own course in a world that had very definite ideas about who she should be and how she should behave. William approached the final section of his mother's diary with a heavy heart, knowing that he was about to read her thoughts from the last months of her life. The morning was gray and still, as if the world itself was holding its breath for these final revelations. He had come to know Diana so intimately through her own words over the past few days that reading about the end of her story felt like approaching the loss of her all over again. The entries from early 1997 showed a Diana who seemed to be finding genuine happiness for the first time in years. Her writing had a lightness to it that had been absent during the difficult period of her divorce and its aftermath. I feel like I'm finally learning what it means to be loved for who I actually am, not for what I represent or what I can provide, she wrote in what must have been the early days of her relationship with Dodi. He doesn't need anything from me except my company. He's not interested in my title or my position. In fact, he understands better than most people how isolating that kind of attention can be. For the first time in years, I feel like I can just be Diana. These entries about Dodi were a revelation to William. The media coverage of their relationship had been sensationalized and often cynical, but Diana's private thoughts revealed someone who had found not just romance, but a sense of peace and acceptance that had eluded her for most of her adult life. We spent the afternoon on his father's yacht, just talking and watching the water, she wrote during what must have been one of their trips together. No photographers, no protocol, no agenda except enjoying each other's company. I had forgotten what it felt like to laugh without wondering if someone was analyzing the sound, to touch someone without considering how it might look in tomorrow's papers. This is what normal people call privacy, and I've missed it more than I realized. But Diana was also realistic about the challenges that any serious relationship would face given her circumstances. She wrote about the intense media scrutiny that followed them everywhere, about the complexity of introducing someone new into her son's lives, about the political implications of a relationship with someone from outside traditional British circles. The papers are having a field day with our relationship, she wrote after particularly intense paparazzi attention during a vacation. They want to make it into a fairy tale or a scandal, depending on which sells more papers. But what we have is much quieter and more real than either of those narratives. It makes me feel peaceful in a way I haven't experienced since I was very young. That's not dramatic enough for headlines, but it's exactly what I need. The diary entries from this period also show Diana's continued dedication to her charitable work. If anything, her happiness in her personal life seemed to energize her professional commitments. She wrote about plans for new campaigns, about her determination to use her remaining time in the spotlight to address issues that might be forgotten after public attention moved on to other stories. I'm planning a major push on the landmine issue this fall, she wrote while outlining her autumn schedule. The initial attention was good, but sustainable change requires sustained pressure. I want to visit more affected areas, meet with more survivors, keep the issue in the public eye until something meaningful is done about it. This might be my most important work. William was struck by his mother's sense of urgency in these final entries. She seemed aware that her window of maximum influence might be limited, either by changing public interest or by her own desire to eventually step back from the spotlight. Her writing showed someone determined to make the most of the platform she had while she still had it. The diary also revealed Diana's evolving thoughts about her son's futures. Now that she was outside the royal system herself, she wrote with new perspective about the pressures they would face and the support they would need. William is becoming so serious about his responsibilities, she wrote after one of their conversations about his future role. Sometimes I worry that he's carrying the weight of expectation too early, that he's not allowing himself to just be a teenager. I try to encourage him to have fun, to make mistakes, to discover who he is apart from who he's supposed to become. But I also understand his sense of duty. He gets that from his father, but I hope he'll also carry some of my belief that real leadership means connecting with people's hearts, not just following protocol. These maternal observations were particularly meaningful to William as he read them. He could remember feeling torn during his teenage years between wanting to live up to his responsibilities and wanting the freedom to figure out his own identity. His mother's understanding of that struggle, as revealed in her diary, helped him appreciate how carefully she had tried to balance encouraging his sense of duty with protecting his right to a genuine childhood. Diana's entries about Harry showed equal concern, but for different reasons. She wrote about his more rebellious nature, his tendency to act out when stressed, and her determination to help him find positive outlets for his energy and emotions. Harry got into trouble at school again today. She wrote about one incident. The teachers see it as defiance, but I know it's his way of processing all the changes and pressures in his life. He's so young to be dealing with divorce, media attention, and the knowledge that his entire future is already planned out. I want him to know that being royal doesn't mean being perfect, and that making mistakes is part of learning who you are. The diary entries from summer 1997 show Diana at what seemed to be a turning point in her life. She wrote about feeling more confident in her choices, more at peace with her role outside the formal royal structure, and more optimistic about her future than she had been in years. "I'm finally understanding that I don't need anyone's permission to be myself," she wrote in what must have been July. "For so long, I was trying to fit into expectations that were never really designed for someone like me. Now I'm creating my own path, using my experience and my position in ways that feel authentic. It's scary sometimes, but it's also incredibly freeing." But these hopeful entries were interspersed with moments of deeper reflection on the costs of her journey. Diana wrote honestly about the loneliness she still sometimes felt, about the difficulty of trusting new people given how many relationships have been complicated by her public status, about her concern for how her choices had affected her children. "I look back at the young woman who married Charles, and I feel both sympathy and frustration for her," she wrote in one particularly introspective entry. "She was so eager to please, so willing to disappear into someone else's vision of who she should be. I don't regret the experiences that taught me to find my own voice, but I do regret how long it took and how many people were hurt along the way, especially the boys. They deserved parents who could find a way to love each other, or at least to separate with more grace." The diary entries from late August 1997 showed Diana making plans for the autumn and beyond. She wrote about projects she wanted to launch, places she wanted to visit, and her hopes for continued growth in her relationship with Dodi. "We talked about the future last night," she wrote about one of their conversations. "Not in a pressure-filled way, but just imagining what life might look like if we continue to be this happy together. It feels strange to think about a future that isn't defined by crisis or conflict. I've been living in survival mode for so long that the possibility of genuine contentment almost seems too good to be true." The final entries in the diary were written during their last trip together, the vacation in France that would end so tragically in Paris. Diana's mood in these final pages was optimistic and peaceful. She wrote about enjoying simple pleasures, good food, beautiful surroundings, and the company of someone who made her laugh. "This has been exactly the kind of break I needed," she wrote in what would be one of her last entries. "Away from England, away from the constant speculation about every aspect of my life. Just time to be present and enjoy the moment. Dodi and I took a long walk on the beach today, and I felt more relaxed than I have in months. Sometimes the simplest pleasures are the most precious." But even in these final entries, Diana's thoughts kept returning to her sons and her charitable work. She wrote about missing William and Harry, about looking forward to telling them about her trip, about her plans to spend quality time with them before they return to school. "I can't wait to see the boys," she wrote. "Harry will want to hear about every detail of the yacht, and William will probably ask thoughtful questions about the places we visited. They're growing up so fast, becoming such interesting people. I want to make sure I'm giving them enough of my time and attention, not just when it's convenient, but consistently. They're the most important thing I'll ever do." The diary's final entry was written the morning of August 31st, 1997. Diana wrote about their plans to return to London, about her eagerness to see her sons, and about her gratitude for the peaceful time she had just experienced. "Heading home today," she wrote in what would be her last words in the diary. "This trip has given me exactly what I needed: perspective, rest, and the reminder that happiness is possible even in complicated circumstances. I feel ready to tackle whatever challenges are waiting back in London. Most importantly, I feel ready to be fully present for William and Harry. They deserve a mother who is not just surviving, but thriving, and for the first time in a long time, I think I can be that for them." William closed the diary with tears streaming down his face. The final entry, written just hours before the car accident that would claim his mother's life, showed a woman who had found peace, love, and purpose after years of struggle. Diana's journey, through her own words, had been one of transformation from an uncertain young woman into someone who had learned to use her unique position to make a meaningful difference in the world. But what struck William most profoundly was not just the public story of Diana's evolution, but the private story of her devotion to him and Harry. Every entry, even during her darkest periods, included thoughts about her sons, their well-being, their development, their future. She had been determined to be more than just a royal mother. She had wanted to be a real mother who provided emotional support, practical wisdom, and unconditional love. As he sat in her study for the last time, surrounded by the boxes of memories and the fading afternoon light, William felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. His mother had left him more than just a title and a legacy of charitable work. She had left him a roadmap for how to navigate the impossible pressures of royal life while remaining true to one's own values and convictions. The diary had shown him a Diana who was complex, flawed, determined, and ultimately triumphant in her quest to create meaning from difficult circumstances. She had made mistakes, faced criticism, endured loneliness, and struggled with personal demons, but she had never stopped trying to become a better person or to use her influence for good. Most importantly, the diary had revealed a mother who had loved her sons completely and who had fought fiercely to give them not just royal training, but the emotional tools they would need to find happiness and purpose in their own lives. Every decision she had made, every risk she had taken, every stand she had taken, had been motivated at least in part by her desire to leave the world a better place for her children. William carefully placed the diary back in its box, but he knew he would return to it many times in the years to come. Whenever he faced difficult decisions in his own role, whenever he struggled with balancing public duty and private conviction, whenever he needed to remember what courage looked like in the face of overwhelming pressure, he would hear his mother's voice in these pages. Diana's diary had given him the greatest gift any parent could leave a child: the knowledge that he had been completely and unconditionally loved, and the example of how to transform personal pain into public purpose. As he prepared to leave her study for the last time, William felt his mother's presence more strongly than he had since the day she died. Through her own words, Diana had reached across 25 years to embrace her son one more time, to tell him that he was loved, and to show him that even in the darkest circumstances, it was possible to find light and to share it with the world. The diary would remain private, a sacred conversation between mother and son, but its lessons would live on in William's own approach to leadership, parenthood, and service. Diana's greatest legacy was not the public work she had done or the causes she had championed, important as those were. Her greatest legacy was the love she had given her sons and the example she had set for how to live with integrity, compassion, and courage in a world that often demanded conformity over authenticity. As William walked out of the palace that evening, he carried with him not just the memory of a lost mother, but the living presence of a woman whose words continued to guide, comfort, and inspire him. Diana's story, as told in her own voice, was ultimately one of triumph, not over circumstances, which had often been beyond her control, but over the temptation to become bitter, cynical, or self-absorbed in the face of extraordinary challenges. She had chosen love over fear, service over comfort, and authenticity over approval. In doing so, she had shown her sons, and through her public work, the world, what it meant to live a life of meaning and purpose, regardless of the obstacles that might stand in the way.